Hello friends, welcome to the Share, Invite, and Proclaim channel. My name is Judy. Well, the move has taken place and I've not gotten my new microphone yet, so I'll see what I can do with this. But I'm still unpacking. I love my new apartment. It is bigger than the last and more efficient. So I've been trying to present Paul's letters in sequence that many scholars have designated. I might disagree or put Philippians, say, in another place, but that's okay. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is the letter itself from the Apostle Paul. And today's letter is from Paul in his Roman prison about 63 AD. And he wrote it right after he wrote Colossians, because the person who was going to deliver the letter to Colossians, Tychicus, well, you know I can't pronounce most of these names, but anyway, Tychicus, Tychicus. Anyway, he was to deliver the letter to the Colossian church that was in the home of Philemon. And guess what? Along with that letter to the entire church, Paul wrote a supplemental letter to his friend Philemon, in which the church was located. And he wrote this, you know, if you could find Philemon in your book, it's the little tiny letter, one pager, right before the book of Hebrews. So it's easy to skip by, but it's a good letter. Philemon was a friend to Paul. Here's how he describes him. He's a beloved brother, a fellow worker. The church is in his house. He loves Jesus and all believers. Paul feels his love and joy and comfort in just knowing Philemon. Philemon was an encourager. He encouraged other believers. And he was hoping that Philemon would do him a favor, so to speak. Philemon's slave, Onesimus, had left Colossae and had gone to Rome for some reason, and met with Paul, heard the gospel, and became a believer. And Paul wanted to send Onesimus back to Philemon. Onesimus wanted to stay and minister to Paul, and Paul needed his encouragement. He needed his assistance. He needed his help. But he felt like that this relationship of master and slave needed to be restored, because in Colossians he talked about slaves and masters. He said that slaves should serve their masters dutifully, honestly, just like they're serving the Lord. But he also said that masters should treat their slaves humanly and respect them. And so Paul felt like that this relationship needed to be restored. So he sent Onesimus back to Philemon with this letter. And in it, Paul pleaded and hoped that Philemon would free his slave and count him as a fellow believer rather than a slave, and maybe even do ill towards him for being a runaway. Paul said, I appeal to you, my child, for my child, Onesimus. Paul considered him a child, whom I have begotten in my imprisonment, who formerly was useless to you because he ran away, but now is useful both to you and me. I have sent him back to you in person, that is, sending my very heart. Now, Paul's throwing it on here. Whom I wish to keep with me, so that on your behalf he might minister to me in my imprisonment for the gospel. But without your consent, I did not want to do anything, so that your goodness would not be in effect by compulsion, but of your own free will. For perhaps he was for this reason separated to you for a while, so that you would have him back forever, no longer a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. So this was Paul's plea to his friend Philemon. Now, we never know, we don't know how this was received by Philemon. We don't know if he set Onesimus free or that he continued as a slave. We don't know the outcome, but we do know Paul's request to his friend Philemon. Now, Paul did expect to be released from prison in about 63 AD because he said to Philemon, having confidence in your obedience, I write to you, since I know that you will even do more than I say. At the same time, also prepare me a lodging, for I hope that although through your prayers, I will be given to you. So Paul expected, since 2 years there hadn't been a trial, he expected to be released from his Roman prison. And if we believe that he was martyred in 65 AD by the Emperor Nero, then we know that Paul spent about 2 years traveling, and that he expected to go back to this part of the world, to go back to Philemon's home and spend a little time with him, and to revisit some of the churches that he had started, and perhaps go to Spain. That was one of his goals, was to go and minister to Christ in Spain. And perhaps that's true. We don't have proof of it because Luke didn't travel with him. And that's how we know of Paul's missionary journeys, is because Luke was with him. Luke was not during this 2-year period. So if Paul traveled, Luke was not with him. Now, some people would get hung up on this letter because of the word slavery. And because it bothered many people and had a wrong connotation in many ways, translators of the Bible began to use the term bond servant. Servant is a little bit more pleasing, so to speak, to the hearer of the gospel. A bond servant, that is, gives a different connotation than a slave. Now, a bond means that you are connected. Servant means that you are serving someone. And in the case of Christianity, you're serving Christ. You're bound with Christ because you believe in him as your Lord and Savior. So, you know, the term slave is that you are totally under the control of the master. And in Christian circles, that's basically what we are to Jesus. We are bound to him unconditionally. We give our entire life and our thoughts and our mind and our behavior, our living to Christ, so that Christ can live through us. So try not to get hung up over the term slave. You know, even in the Old Testament, they had slavery. Joseph was considered a slave when he was purchased by Potiphar. Slavery goes back to about over 6,000 BC, when tribes in Mesopotamia won wars against enemies. They would keep some of their people for slavery to serve them. So slavery's been around a long time. Of course, we think that it's still in existence today when you have not as a broadcast thing, but underground. Now, since many of the early churches were in homes where the wealthy had slaves, and the slaves there would serve if there was any serving to be done, but they also were expected to wash the feet of the guests. And I wonder how many of these slaves actually heard the gospel story from the pastor, and how many accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior. Just curious. There's no way to know. I do want you to know that Paul did not try to change the culture about the morality of slavery. He didn't try to change the culture. And this is important to me because when we begin to talk about Timothy, Paul did not change the culture of the first century worship, of the things that women should do or could not do. It was based on cultural ideas, particularly from his Pharisaic Jewish background. So we'll get into that when we begin to talk about Timothy, because 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are the last 3 letters that Paul wrote before his martyrdom, and they were written as he was traveling around. And so we'll get to that in our next video, 1 Timothy. Now, Paul did say in Colossians that a believer has a new self when they accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior, that the barriers between people are removed. Barriers. There's no distinction between Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian. Scythian are those tribes that were north of the Caspian and Black Seas, slave and freedman. Christ is all. And the emphasis is upon unity, not division. And so it poses a big problem for Paul in his Timothy message to Timothy in Ephesus. But we'll get into that and maybe make some sense of it, or leave it as it is with controversy. Anyway, we will shoot for unity. Thank you for watching, and I pray that if you need some assistance in knowing about Christ, listen to Romans 10:9, that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. God can lead you to people that will lead you to Christ. They will help you grow in your Christian maturity. Find a church where you hear about Jesus, who he was, who he is, and who he will be at the second coming, that it can further your spiritual growth. Thanks for watching. Share with those who need a word from the Lord. Thank you.